David Anthony Burke was not a household name for very long before his life changed dramatically. Known professionally as D4vd, pronounced David, he emerged from the world of social media and gaming, and quickly became one of the young artists attracting attention from millions of listeners. Born in 2005, Burke began building an audience online with emotional, atmospheric music that connected particularly well with younger listeners. His songs were often featured alongside Fortnite and gaming content, helping his music spread far beyond traditional music platforms. Then came the song that changed everything. His breakout hit, Romantic Homicide, turned D4vd from an internet sensation into a rapidly rising music star. The song found a massive audience, and the attention eventually led to a multi-million-dollar recording deal with Interscope Records. For someone still in his teens, the rise was extraordinary. By early 2025, Burke appeared to be entering the next major stage of his career. A debut studio album was on the horizon, and plans for a significant tour were underway. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of a dream. A young artist had built a career from his bedroom, and the internet attracted millions of listeners, signed with a major record label, and was preparing to take his music to an even larger audience. But behind that rapidly growing public image was a private relationship that prosecutors would later place at the center of a horrifying criminal case. And within months, the story surrounding D4vd would no longer be about music, success, or a promising young career. It would become a case involving the death of a 14-year-old girl, allegations of sexual abuse, and a prosecution that would eventually accuse Burke of one of the most disturbing crimes imaginable. The girl at the center of the case was Celeste Rivas Hernandez, a teenager from Lake Elsinore, California. And understanding what happened to Celeste and how investigators eventually connected her death to a rising music star begins with the relationship between the two. At the center of the case was a 14-year-old girl named Celeste Rivas Hernandez from Lake Elsinore, California. According to prosecutors, Celeste and David Burke had known each other for several years before her death. Prosecutors allege that Burke first met Celeste when she was just 11 years old. They further allege that when Celeste was 13 and Burke was 18, their relationship became sexual, a relationship prosecutors say continued for at least a year. Those allegations form a major part of the criminal case against Burke. Court documents describe alleged communications between the two that prosecutors say referenced sex, pregnancy, abortion, and the use of Plan B. Prosecutors have characterized those communications as evidence of an ongoing sexual relationship involving a minor under the age of 14. But there was another important part of Celeste's story. Her family had reported her missing multiple times during 2024. Authorities were familiar with her as a runaway, and investigators say she sometimes stayed with Burke in the Los Angeles area. That detail would later become significant because it placed Celeste within Burke's orbit well before the events of April 2025. According to prosecutors, however, the relationship eventually became increasingly unstable. They allege that Celeste had become jealous of other women in Burke's life, and that tensions between the two continued to build. Then came the 22nd of April 2025. The two exchanged a lengthy series of text messages during what prosecutors describe as a serious argument. At one point, according to prosecutors, Celeste threatened to tell her father things about Burke that she said could end his career and his life. For investigators, those messages would later become an important part of the timeline because they occurred just one day before Celeste disappeared. The following day, April 23, prosecutors allege that Burke arranged an Uber to pick Celeste up from her home and take her to his rented property in the Hollywood Hills. According to the prosecution's account, Celeste arrived at the house, and what happened next would become the central question in one of Los Angeles County's most closely watched criminal cases. Prosecutors allege that within approximately 20 minutes of Celeste arriving at the residence, Burke attacked her with a sharp instrument. They say she suffered multiple penetrating injuries to her chest and abdomen. One of those wounds, according to the medical evidence presented by prosecutors, penetrated her liver. Celeste did not survive. The Los Angeles County medical examiner later determined that her manner of death was homicide, with the cause attributed to multiple penetrating injuries. But at this point in the story, one question remained unanswered. What happened inside that Hollywood Hills house after Celeste was killed? According to prosecutors, what followed was not an attempt to immediately seek help. Instead, they allege that a series of purchases, movements, and actions began actions that investigators would later interpret as an elaborate attempt to conceal what had happened. And those alleged actions would eventually become some of the most disturbing evidence presented in the case. According to prosecutors, what happened after Celeste's death was just as disturbing as the killing itself. They allege that Burke began taking deliberate steps to conceal the crime and destroy evidence. Investigators later traced a series of purchases to the Hollywood Hills property. Prosecutors say the orders were placed using a fictitious name and included items that, taken together, painted a disturbing picture. 2 chainsaws, a shovel, a burn cage, body bags, heavy-duty laundry bags, a mop, and a blue inflatable swimming pool. According to the prosecution, these were not random purchases. They allege that Burke used the chainsaws to dismember Celeste's body inside the garage, with the inflatable pool used during the process. Prosecutors also allege that Celeste's left ring finger and pinky finger were cut off because one of the fingers carried a tattoo connected to Burke. That detail would later become particularly significant to investigators. When forensic specialists examined the remains, they reportedly found tiny fragments of blue plastic embedded in the body. Prosecutors said those fragments were consistent with material from the inflatable pool investigators had linked to the Hollywood Hills garage. The forensic trail did not stop there. According to evidence presented by prosecutors, Celeste's DNA was recovered from the garage, while blood evidence connected to her was also found inside the house and inside Burke's Tesla. But investigators faced another strange detail. Celeste's phone appeared to go silent on April 23, the same day prosecutors say she was killed. Yet Burke allegedly continued communicating with the phone afterward. Prosecutors say he sent messages and made calls asking where Celeste was, behavior they argue was intended to create the appearance that she was still alive. Meanwhile, Burke's public life continued. Around this same period, his debut album was released, while his music career was moving forward. To the outside world, there was no obvious indication that something horrific had allegedly happened behind the scenes. Then the summer arrived. In late July 2025, surveillance footage and vehicle data allegedly showed Burke driving his Tesla and parking it near his Hollywood Hills rental property. He then left Los Angeles as he continued with his concert tour. The Tesla remained behind, and for weeks, the vehicle sat there without anyone knowing what was inside. Around September 5, the Tesla was towed to an impound lot. 3 days later, on September 8, workers noticed something deeply disturbing. A strong odor of decay was coming from the vehicle. Police were called. Investigators opened the Tesla and began searching the vehicle. What they discovered inside would transform the case completely. The missing teenager, who had been the subject of unanswered questions for months, was about to be found but not alive. And the location where her remains were discovered would immediately place the investigation's focus back on the young musician at the center of the case. When investigators searched the Tesla, they found something far more disturbing than they had expected. Inside the vehicle's front trunk, commonly known as the frunk, investigators discovered a black cadaver bag. Inside that bag were the remains of a young woman. According to the prosecution, the remains were later identified as those of Celeste Rivas Hernandez. Beneath the cadaver bag, investigators found another plastic garbage bag containing her severed arms and legs. The remains had been badly decomposed, making visual identification difficult. Investigators ultimately relied on dental records to confirm Celeste's identity. There were other details that drew investigators' attention. A tattoo was documented on one of Celeste's fingers. Prosecutors later pointed to similarities between that tattoo and one associated with Burke. 2 fingers from Celeste's other hand were never recovered. The discovery immediately transformed what had been a missing person investigation into a homicide investigation. And investigators now had a much bigger question to answer. How did Celeste's remains end up inside a Tesla registered to David Burke? What happened inside the Hollywood Hills property? And who was responsible for her death? Over the following months, investigators worked to reconstruct the events surrounding Celeste's disappearance and death. According to prosecutors, the investigation eventually brought together multiple categories of evidence. Investigators examined phones and computers, reviewed data from the Tesla's systems, traced Amazon purchases allegedly made under an alias, analyzed text messages, examined DNA evidence, and reviewed surveillance footage. Prosecutors say those different pieces of evidence formed a timeline that repeatedly pointed toward Burke, but investigators did not immediately arrest him. The case went through an extended investigation that included grand jury proceedings as authorities continued building their case. Then, nearly 7 months after Celeste's remains were discovered, the investigation reached a major turning point. On the 16th of April, 2026, Los Angeles police arrested David Burke at his Hollywood Hills home. 4 days later, prosecutors formally charged him with first-degree murder, continuous sexual abuse of a child under the age of 14, and unlawful mutilation of human remains. Prosecutors also alleged special circumstances, including murder of a witness, murder for financial gain, and lying in wait. Those allegations potentially made the murder case eligible for the death penalty. Burke was held without bail. But there was an important distinction that would remain at the center of the case. An arrest and criminal charges are not a conviction. Burke has pleaded not guilty. And from the beginning, his defense attorneys have maintained that he did not kill Celeste and was not responsible for her death. The defense has argued that the prosecution's case is largely circumstantial and does not establish beyond a reasonable doubt that Burke was responsible for the homicide. His attorneys have also pointed to messages between Burke and Celeste that they say demonstrated continued care and concern, including communications after the two had reportedly broken up in late 2024. So while prosecutors say the forensic, digital, and circumstantial evidence tells one story, the defense says it tells another, and that difference is critical. Because the question in court is not simply whether investigators found disturbing evidence. The question is whether that evidence can ultimately prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that David Burke committed the crimes he has been charged with. That question would soon move from the investigation room into a courtroom. By July 2026, the case had reached another major turning point. A multi-day preliminary hearing was held in Los Angeles County Superior Court before Judge Charlene Olmedo. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors presented evidence they said connected Burke to Celeste's death. The hearing included graphic photographs of Celeste's remains, testimony concerning the alleged purchase of chainsaws and other equipment, and forensic evidence involving Celeste's blood. Prosecutors also walked through the timeline they had constructed from text messages, phone activity, surveillance footage, and movements connected to Burke, but a preliminary hearing is not a criminal trial. At this stage, the judge was not deciding whether Burke was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The question was whether prosecutors had presented enough evidence to establish probable cause for the charges to continue. On July 27 and 28, 2026, Judge Olmedo ruled that prosecutors had met that threshold on the charges and alleged special circumstances. Burke was therefore ordered to stand trial. A post-preliminary arraignment was scheduled for the 31st of August 2026, after which the court can move towards setting a trial date. For the family of Celeste Rivas Hernandez, the case has been about something much more personal than courtroom procedure. It is about a 14-year-old girl whose life ended in circumstances that prosecutors describe as horrific. And for the public, the case has attracted enormous attention, partly because of the stark contrast between the image of D4vd that millions of fans knew and the allegations now being made against him. To many people, Burke was a young, soft-spoken musician who had built an extraordinary career through the internet. But prosecutors now accuse him of crimes involving a vulnerable teenage girl and an alleged effort to conceal her death. The case also raises broader questions that extend beyond the courtroom. How can vulnerable minors become trapped in relationships with older individuals? What happens when a young celebrity's private life becomes entangled with allegations of serious criminal conduct? And how should the public separate a person's carefully constructed public image from what prosecutors allege happened behind closed doors? Those questions may remain part of the public conversation, but inside the courtroom, the standard is different. David Anthony Burke has pleaded not guilty and continues to maintain his innocence through his attorneys. The prosecution's evidence, including digital records, forensic findings, surveillance footage, text messages, and other testimony, will ultimately have to withstand the scrutiny of a jury, and the allegations made in court will have to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. As of August 2026, the case remains pending. There has been no trial verdict. No jury has found David Burke guilty. And until that happens, the allegations remain allegations. What comes next could determine not only the future of a young music career, but also whether prosecutors can prove their case in one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in Los Angeles. For Celeste Rivas Hernandez's family, however, the central hope remains much simpler. They want justice for their daughter. And now, that question moves to the next stage of the